going to talk about boundaries. Boundaries define human use of space in so many ways and on so many scales. We have our own personal boundaries, such as personal space, room space, seat space. We place boundaries around what we can and will search on the internet, which further adds to the complexity of how we act within our areas we call our own. The purpose of this video is to look at the boundaries that exist between and within countries. If you're like me, you think of boundaries in terms of how they appear on a political map. While the boundaries between states on a map are very real and have very real implications, many of the boundaries that demarcate the end of one area and the start of another are not even based on actual features, but rather imaginary lines that may or may not have been indicated on the Earth's surface. Also, many boundaries have existed in the past and may not exist as boundaries today. And what about mountains, bodies of water, and desert? Let's break it down. Mark Rubenstein's The Cultural Landscape divides boundaries into three main categories: natural, cultural, and geometric. Let's look at the natural boundaries first. Natural boundaries are those that exist on the Earth's natural landscapes. Mountains, deserts, and large bodies of water make up natural boundaries. Humans have a problem with Earth's features when they're too wet, too cold, too dry, or too high. Not only can we not live in these harsh regions permanently, but they're very hard to cross. The Indus Valley civilization was protected in the north by the large Himalayan mountain range that separates South Asia from East Asia. The Egyptians were protected by deserts on either side of the Nile River Valley. Forests and water can also serve as boundaries between one place and another. Physical borders made it easy to defend controlled territory in ancient history, and also made it easy to determine where something is situated. Cultural boundaries are usually those that are denoted by differences in ethnicity, particularly those that may have differing linguistic, religious, or ideological characteristics. People tend to cluster with what is familiar to them, and sometimes form rivalries with those nearby. European countries are great for measuring this phenomenon, especially when you're looking at the linguistic and religious difference. Also, Shia and Sunni Islam in the Middle East exemplify cultural boundaries. Still, another great example of a cultural boundary is within Africa. If you look at Africa divided by ethnicity rather than political boundaries, you can see why there is so much unrest in many African countries. Rival groups compete for power based on cultural identity, such as within South Sudan. The last category of boundary is the geometric boundary. These are boundaries placed on Earth by people and don't follow any sort of physical or cultural guidelines. Simply, they are represented by imaginary lines such as latitude or longitude, or some other form of marking. Many of the boundaries we see on a political map of the world today are geometric boundaries, and are often easy to determine by their boring, bland shapes. Some of the most obvious examples exist in Midwestern United States and North Africa. Still, many cultural and geometric boundaries can be further subdivided in order for us to more fully understand the influence humans have on why we organize space the way that we do. Antecedent boundaries are boundaries that were decided even before the development of the territory in question. A great example of an antecedent boundary is the United States and Canada border, a region divided based on the notion that the United States would control all of the territory between the east and the west coasts of North America. Another example of an antecedent boundary is one between Malaysia and Indonesia on the island of Borneo, according to the College Board. A subsequent boundary is a type of boundary that was decided after human settlement or in response to it. Usually, these boundaries are created in order to reduce the conflict between various cultural groups, such as the boundary between Pakistan and India after the British left the subcontinent. Pakistan became the country for Muslims in the region, and Hindus remained in India. A superimposed boundary, then, is one that was forced on the people by powerful governments that have the power to enforce them. An example of a superimposed boundary is basically all of Africa. As we already discussed, African ethnic groups isolate themselves and compete with one another because of linguistic and cultural reasons. During the Berlin Conference in the 1880s, many of the current boundaries were shaped based on where each imperial country was in control. Therefore, the current political borders don't take into account the ethnic identities of the people living within those countries today. Finally, a relic boundary is a boundary that no longer exists as a boundary, but rather as a historical symbol that indicates political and cultural changes over time. The Great Wall of China is far south of the current border, but used to be a man-made marker between what the Chinese were capable of defending and the barbarians that existed to the north. Other examples of relic boundaries include Hadrian's Wall, and the Berlin Wall. Understanding boundaries is crucial for fully understanding how humans use space on Earth. It helps us to understand how we have changed, moved, and adapted our use of space over time. To understand boundaries is to understand a huge part of the cultural landscape and our place in it. We're able to see how our view of land and territory has evolved continually, and we can better predict how it will continue to change throughout our time on the third rock from the sun. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time on Professor Dustin. Peace out, students.